make sure I've got my bits and bobs here to speak to. So I rise to speak on this matter we have before us about the direction that would send the proposal for a stadium at Macquarie Point into the PoSS process. I think I appreciate the forthrightness of the previous member's comments, Member for Hobart, on this matter, and the reflections of the member for Murchison. There'll be some matters that I'll touch on that probably have been covered by those members, but I'll reiterate them in the context of my own reflections. It's not a matter that I've got a prepared speech on, because we have been receiving new information right up until today, and I'm finding it an interesting one to continue to consider. I've also found it to be, Mr President, a fairly unpleasantly contentious matter, actually, as it's been progressed as a matter of discussion in the public domain, and the manner in which that has occurred. And I think that has stemmed from the way that it came about, the way that it was put into the public discussion by the government, and the early stages of its progress there as a matter for public discussion. And I think that the way that occurred has set this consideration of this project and the fundamental idea behind it of an AFL team for our state, has set that onto a really unfortunate course that has involved a great deal more contention and unpleasantness than we all would have hoped that it might have. I think that the fundamentals are that we could all have and would all have been rallying around the idea of a AFL team for this state. I think there was broad support. And where there wasn't overt support, there might have just been a fairly neutral stance held by most people. I haven't come across anyone, I must say, who has said to me that they don't think we should have a team. I've come across people who think, don't really care, don't really mind, don't have a strong view, but no one who said, here's a reason we shouldn't have a team. So what should have been something that was fairly universally unifying has become incredibly disruptive and divisive. I fundamentally see that as problematic. I think it's certainly a result of a government that started with an outcome that it wanted to then insist upon and pursued in such a way that was belligerent, that didn't follow good process and good governance, that continued over time at every opportunity and every turn to promote division in the community as we worked through various stages of this, and that is an incredibly irresponsible way to govern this state. It's an incredibly unproductive way to achieve an outcome that's positive for our community. And actually what I think we've arrived at now is it's showing us that it certainly isn't a guaranteed way to get what might be in the best interests of our state, the best kind of proposal to consider, the most ideal and optimal way that we could progress a project that would deliver the ultimate outcome we're after, but tick as many boxes of public interest on the way through as we can. And we're seeing that because right now at this late-ish stage of discussion, we're seeing alternative proposals put forward that are significantly well developed, perhaps not as developed yet as they need to be, say, today put into a PoSS process, but they are significantly well developed. They have been undertaken, and I guess I'm saying they, but I mean one in particular. We're talking about the one that's been put forward by Dean Coleman and the Stadium Precinct group.
MAC 2.
MAC 2.0, as some are referring to it.
That's the one at Regatta Point.
The one that's just around the corner.
Regatta grounds. Yeah.
On the Regatta grounds. So that project is significantly well developed in what it's been put forward, and actually has paid attention to all the ways that the government and its project failed on good process, and have made best endeavours on the face of it to address all those matters in a way that is consultative, collaborative, creative and responsible when it comes to the consideration of what ultimately might be a proposal that's in the best interests of our state. So I think that the government has been utterly shown up at this point in time, utterly shown up for the poor way that it approached this from the very start, the disrespect that it demonstrated to the Tasmanian people, and in particular to some particular stakeholders here with sensitivities. And when I say that, I mean the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, I mean the RSL, I mean the Regatta Association, and I mean the Hobart City Council, as well as the people of Tasmania. The disrespect shown to those stakeholders in the process that was undertaken in the government, and I can't use the word progressing their proposal because it wasn't progressing, it was absolutely bulldozing through with their proposal. It was bullying their way through with their proposal. It was insisting and then demanding that people come along for that proposal to be progressed. And that is not appropriate. It's not respectful. It's not good governance. And guess what? It hasn't given us what would be the best public outcome and public interest outcome here with the proposal put forward. I think that is shown up utterly by the fact that we can see other well-developed proposals put forward that appear to address many issues much better than the government's does. So, Mr. President, having said that, I actually believe that we could, what has happened is the government has started with the outcome they wanted, the decision they wanted to make, and then they've worked back from there. And that's problematic, and that's what I've just described as having been a failed process, delivering us a less than optimal outcome to consider now in this PoSS directive. What we could do, of course, is start with any endpoint and work back and find a way to make it work and fit. The government could certainly do that right now with an alternative proposal that is in the public domain before us. They could start with the presumption that, yep, that's one we want to see delivered. Let's work back and make it fit and make it work and fill in all the gaps and provide the details that need to be provided. That's what they did with their own process. They could very readily turn around and do it again with this one. And in saying that, I'm not saying that they are the same proposals. They are different proposals. They do have different complexities and different risks, but they also have different benefits potentially for the Tasmanian community and different positive outcomes to achieve in terms of public interest. So if we wanted to see that alternative proposal progressed, we could begin with that as our endpoint and work back, just like the government did with its own. Again, in my view, that's not a good process, but here we are at a point where we've already been driven into this disarray of good governance. We've already been driven into this divisive place. I actually think that the alternative proposal put forward is potentially a saving grace for the government, a saving grace to provide what could be the most unifying outcome from all this. Could provide the most opportunity, the greatest opportunity to bring the most Tasmanians together around delivering a stadium and ultimately delivering an AFL team to the state. Because my goodness, and I think other members would reflect on this too, when you go out and talk to people out in the community, they are far more attracted, by and large, to the second proposal than they are to the government's proposal. And that's not to say that everybody agrees with it, they certainly don't. Lots of people wouldn't agree with either of the proposals. But when I talk to people who actually, on the face of it, utterly rejected the government's proposal, but now are very warmly speaking about the second proposal from Dean Coleman and Stadium Precinct, it's fascinating to see the difference of opinion there and the opportunity to optimise unity again. I seriously hope that the government take stock and aren't just paying lip service and sort of fobbing off that proposal, saying they're happy to continue to consider it, and in February more details can be provided and considered. I hope that that's not just fobbing off and baseless invitations to the proposal, the second proposal. I hope that it's genuine.
Through you, Mr President, I think what they're trying to figure out is how much revenue comes back to the team and those sorts of things through this particular proposal, and that's why they're after the financials, because quite honestly that's why a new stadium is required, because without it, you know, they can't get the revenues that they want. That's basically it, as far as I'm aware. But anyway.
I think we'd be speculating on that. I suspect because there are actually significantly more elements to the second proposal and more complexity to what's proposed, because it's not just building something on a piece of land, it's digging out and creating land into the river, and there's complex elements to it, none of which are insurmountable, all of which could be contemplated. And if we were to agree that that's looking like a more optimal outcome, we could find ways to make it work, potentially. I do find it bizarre, Mr President, quite bizarre, for it to hear in our briefing from Mr Lennon this morning on that second proposal, 2.0, that the government is insisting that those proponents of that proposal demonstrate that they've consulted with Hobart City Council, with RSL and with the Regatta Association, and that they're all on board with it. I find it absolutely bizarre, because at no point, particularly through the earliest stages, did the government demonstrate that for their own proposal. Absolutely not. In fact, the opposite. In fact, the opposite. What we had heard, and this is in the public domain through hearings from the Public Accounts Committee, held during the inquiry on the feasibility of this around this proposal, we heard quite clearly that all those proponents heard about the government's proposal the day that it landed in the media. That's the RSL, the Hobart City Council, Regatta Association. Virtually none of them heard about it, and if they heard about it before the day it arrived in the media, it was a matter of days or maybe a week or two before. No opportunity to actually be involved and genuinely consulted. To hear from the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, which is on the public record in hearings from the Public Accounts Committee, when we heard from Greg Lehman, Professor Greg Lehman, to hear that someone who'd been intimately involved in what then was the master planning for the Macquarie Point site, and the aspect of it that there was the Aboriginal Truth and Reconciliation Park. He had been involved for a couple of years at that point in a co-design process with the Aboriginal community towards developing that park as part of a central part of what had been the master plan. And to hear from him in the Public Accounts Committee hearing that he heard about the utter scrapping of that plan and imposition of a new plan for a stadium in the media is utterly astonishing and disrespectful. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And while I'm on the topic of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, I think they're still being disrespected here. To have now another precinct plan put out with what is effectively potentially a Tasmanian Aboriginal culturally informed nature strip to this stadium is utterly astonishing. And if you dig into the documents that are there for this newly released Macquarie Point precinct plan, and you look at what they say in their consultation strategy, it's very neutrally put, Mr President, but it's telling when it says, under engagement with stakeholders and under a subheading connection with the site's past, it says it was clear from early conversations with members of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that there is a need for a fresh conversation with the community around the delivery of a culturally informed space at Mac Point before proceeding with a truth and reconciliation specific concept. Now that reads to me like they were rebuffed when they went back and said, oh, yep, sorry, we scrapped the last idea when we were developing with you. Whoops, shall we talk about the next idea? And they've been told, from my reading of that, bugger off. Excuse my language, Mr President, unparliamentary. And it's probably my assumption, but it'd be interesting to have that corrected, because then when I look in the Mac Point draft precinct plan document on the website, and I look to page 20, 3.1.2, Aboriginal Culturally Informed Zone, and we find out more there about the fact that it sounds pretty likely that while the government might have thought it could throw out the previous idea, which was centrally focused around the idea of a park, and then just whack it in where it could fit around the side of a stadium under its new proposal, it sounds to me from the description here that the Aboriginal community are not that thrilled about that necessarily. And an assumption was made that this something could be just transferable from the previous concept into this one. In fact, when the Premier himself fronted the Public Accounts Committee when we were having hearings on the inquiry on this matter, the Premier confirmed that he hadn't, ahead of the decision or at that time since the decision, personally made contact with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community about the scrapping of the previous plan and the assumed inclusion of a partial version of that in this new plan. He hadn't had contact with them, and neither had the relevant Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. The Macquarie Point Development Corporation was beginning engagement with the Aboriginal community, and I recognise that. But I think this government has absolutely taken the Tasmanian Aboriginal community for granted, has treated them disgracefully, disrespectfully, and I think it's absolutely a travesty that we would have thrown out the idea of centralising and really focusing and showcasing an Aboriginal Truth and Reconciliation Park for that site with a stadium dumped in on top and relegating it to, as I said, Mr President, an effective nature strip to the stadium. I do note that the